Hi everyone, this is Alter Ego Studios. We've decided to make a few tutorial videos to show people a little bit of what happens behind the scenes and to share some of the skills that we've gathered over the years. Now, after asking a few of you what you would like to see us do and show you, the most resounding answer was to show you guys how we make our rubber urethane cowls. Now there's several techniques to do this, but the best technique that we have found is to make what's called a matrix mold. So in this series of tutorials we aim to guide you through the process of making matrix molds and making your own rubber urethane cowls. This will include prepping and sizing a master cowl file ready for printing, printing the master where and how, creating a matrix mold shell in Zbrush, printing those shells, finishing and prepping the master cowl print, finishing and prepping the matrix mold shells, chemicals, a guide to using silicons and urethane rubbers, matrix mold assembly and silicon pouring, demolding and mold finishing, how to build a simple rotocaster, and finally how we cast urethane rubber copies. But to begin with, we need to do our very first lesson, which is prepping and sizing a master cowl file ready for printing. So before we go into this, I think that I should probably guide you through some of the very rough terminology. So here we have the model of what we want to achieve. What we want to produce are wearable rubber versions of this model that we have loaded into Zbrush right here. So as you can see, you've got these pieces here that fill in the mouth, fill in the eyes, and you've got this extra mass coming out the bottom of the cowl. We'll talk about more of this later. But all of this right here that you see is referred to as the master. So it's the main original sculpt or print that you want to be able to make rubber wearable copies of. So the best way to do this, we think, is to make a matrix mold. So you have to mold this somehow to be able to pour urethane rubber into it. That involves basically giving it a coat of silicon, then giving it a shell around the outside of the silicon to make sure the silicon stays rigid, and then to remove the master, and then you have a mold. The old school method of doing it is to basically coat it in a layer of silicon using paint brushes or other techniques, and then once it's covered in silicon, it's then basically using fiberglass to slowly but surely build up a shell around it. Now, doing a matrix mold is slightly different. With a matrix mold, what you tend to do is you actually design it all digitally first, or at least that's the modern way of doing things. So you take the master and you design this shell all the way around it, and I've just removed the two front portions of the shell here and here. So you design a shell so that there's a small gap all the way around the inside of the model, so that once you've printed the master, once you've printed all the pieces of the shell and you've assembled it together, you can pour silicon in through the top, and the silicon will basically pour in and fill up the void in between the shell and the master. And then finally, once it is full, and the blue here represents the silicon, I'm just going to load back in the bits of shell. What you can essentially do is you can take all the bits of shell off, you can peel off the silicon, put it the right way around again. You can then put the silicon back inside the shell without the master being there. And so if we look underneath, you'll essentially end up with something that looks a little bit like this. So it'll be an empty mold for you to pour your silicon or your urethane rubber into to produce urethane rubber copies of the original master. Anyway, let's get into it. Lesson 1. Hi everyone, I'm Tom
And I'm Phil.
from A Studios.
So what we're doing here is we're giving you the basics of ZBrush. We're not going into all the things it can do, 3D sculpting and all the other things. How to get yourself a model set up into ZBrush.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, ZBrush is an absolutely crazy program that can do a lot of different things, and even in ZBrush there's a lot of different ways to skin the same cat. So we're going to be exploring how to create a cowl pretty much from start to finish. Now there's several ways of doing this, there's several different softwares you can use, but this is the way that just we do it, this is the way we've learned to do it, this is the way that through a lot of trial and error we think is the best for us. So, Phil.
You've chosen yours never to open, but first time you do, it comes up
with that, doesn't it?
With that, and then you've got to X out of that. That's just basically ZBrush's little like information about things people have created, and also what you'll find is if you leave ZBrush alone for a long time, it'll go into a bit of a picture mode where it shows you a few different pictures. However, you X out of that, okay, and then basically you'll come into this part and you'll squiggle around a bit there, Tom, like this, and what you do in there is nothing, and then you just think, what the hell? And first time I ever loaded up ZBrush, I did this about 3 times and then just X'd out and was like, yeah, I can't use that program, don't know what's going on.
Alright, so the first thing we have to do is we have to import the files. These can either be STL files, OBJ files, there are a few more, and I'm basically going to import a new model. Sometimes you might get a dialog box with an STL clicking OK, and then what you have to do is you basically have to drag the model into existence. So I'm just going to focus somewhere on the center of the screen, I'm going to drag out, and without letting go of my mouse button, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down Shift, and it's going to sort of almost lock it in place. It's going to lock it upright. If I press Shift over here, it'll lock it sideways and so on. So what I want to do is have it roughly down, hold down Shift, and then just drag it as big as I want. It doesn't really matter at this point in time how big you drag the item, because it will always be relative to the size of the actual STL that's loaded in. I know that sounds weird to get your head around, but you'll see what we mean later on.
I would say if you accidentally drag out another item like this, then the first item becomes a 2D image, and the second item then becomes something you can turn into a 3D image. Now, barring the fact that you've just dragged 2 into existence and you're panicking and you're like, what the hell do I do now? The best thing to do is just Control N, and that will basically wipe the screen. Basically brings up a new, fresh background or whatever you want to call it.
So at this point you can sort of load as many into the scene as you want to in all sorts of different weird angles. You can't do anything with it, you can only look at it front on, but Control N, you just want to get one clean one. So I'm holding down Shift, and then I'm dragging it to the size that I want, and then I'm letting go of the mouse button and then Shift. So at this point in time, what you now want to do is you want to go up here to Edit, and you want to click Edit to take you into edit mode. So from here you've seen this little guy appear. So this obviously gives us all of our views of the model by dragging him around. And if you want to reset at any point, you can actually just click on it to reset. If I take the space that's around the model, the empty space, I can also drag it with my left mouse button to rotate the item around. And then what I can do is reset it like that by clicking on him.
The other thing you can do, Tom, is you can click on the red arrow, and that'll give you a side-on view. Click it again, gives you the other side-on view. Or you can click the green or the blue to bring it back to center.
Once we know how to rotate around the object, the main button that you're going to be pressing a lot for navigation is the Alt button, left Alt. So if I drag to here, now if I hold Alt and then I drag with my left mouse button, you can see that it pans around. But if I hold Alt, I then hold down the left mouse button but then let go of Alt but keep my left mouse button held down, it turns into a zoom.
I will say, when it comes to zooming, I find it easier to use the buttons. There are 4 buttons down the side here. One to click it into frame at the top, one to rotate. There you are, Tom. You can click that, and if you've lost your model, you don't know where it's gone in the space.
Yeah,
you can just
if
click
you've
frame.
if you've panned way over there, you can just and you don't know where it is. You're trying to scroll around, trying to spot it. Click frame, and it'll bring it back into frame. And then you also have things here like you've got rotate, so you can just drag on that square there, and then you've got your zoom 3D, which you can also use there. But I personally find it faster to. It's difficult at first to maybe pick up the knack of using the left Alt key, but in my opinion, once you get the knack of it and you can look around, it's a little bit faster than having just to go over to the side.
100%. For me, I haven't got the knack of that. I haven't concentrated on that skill. Me and Tom have very opposite skills when it comes to ZBrush. We do things in very different ways, and one works perfect for one thing and one works perfect for another, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I found is if you try and watch other tutorials and learn the different aspects of ZBrush, depending on the tutorials you watch is the sort of avenue of skills you will end up going down. So you sort of end up knowing how to do the same thing in ZBrush, but like a few different ways, or different people learn to do the same thing a few different ways. So, right, we know how to pan around, we know how to rotate, we know how to sort of zoom in and out. The next thing we need to do is maybe load another model into this scene. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on a different poly mesh over here, either the cylinder or the star, and I'm basically going to import a new model. And I'm going to import this 24-inch bust that I've got that we'll make available for you guys as well. There we go. So there we have our bust, and if I click back here, here we have the cowl. So what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to open up this drop down here, which is subtool, and in the subtool drop down box you basically have a list of subtools, and the subtools are the sort of different models that are loaded into the scene that you can sort of manipulate individually and move around. We'll talk a lot more about this later on when it comes time to actually editing the model. So really the first thing you want to do is you want to scroll down a little bit and you want to go to insert, and then you've got basically a few preloaded models in here, and then you've got a couple of the ones that you've loaded in. So you want to insert this model into your current scene, which is the 24-inch bust. Click on it and it should load in. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to zoom out, or you could click frame to actually get them both in frame at the same time, and I can see that they're a bit apart from each other, so I sort of need to move them around to match them up in the same place. So in ZBrush, if you press B is basically your sort of brush menu, and brings up all of these different brushes, all of these different functions, all of these different ways of essentially editing the mesh that's in front of you. But for now, I just want you to go B and then transpose. And transpose gives us our most basic sort of moving around tool, a repositioning and resizing tool. So you've got obviously your sort of rotational rings, you've got your repositioning, and you've got your sort of resizing. It's probably at this point worth talking about the history bar, Phil.
Yeah.
So you've got at the top here this history bar, and as you're going along through moves or editing each subtool, the history bar fills up, right? but at any point you can undo and go through the history of where that model was and how that model loaded. So I'm just going to go back.
You know what's interesting? If you go back to the history number 1,
Yeah,
you'll see that the model loaded in where you wanted it and then jumped away.
Yeah, that is weird. Right, okay, so above it you've got these other functions. So you've got the customize, you've got sticky mode, you've got go to unmasked mesh center, you've got mesh to axis, reset mesh orientation, and lock and unlock. So because I know out of my subtools I'm editing the head right now, I want the sort of center of this to be where the head is. So what I'm going to do is making sure that the head's selected. I'm going to go to the lock icon, I'm going to unlock the item, and then I'm going to go to this one right here, go to unmasked mesh center. I'm going to click it and it's going to center into that head, and then I want to lock it in place of that head. Then what I'm going to do is, with that now locked, if I press the home button, it'll go to the very center and home of the entire scene. So I'm going to go to that, just like so, and then I'm going to repeat that process with the cowl, just to make sure that that is also perfectly centered. So again, I'm going to unlock, I'm going to go to mesh center, it already is, I'm going to go to lock again, I'm going to go to home. There we go.
Send it home.
And it is.
Now, how long did it take us to learn that instead of dragging it all the way over from somewhere else?
Yeah, it's just these simple little things, isn't it, that make your life a little bit easier. Right, okay, so now I'm going to try and obviously edit it by dragging it using these arrows up and down to feature that on there. Now, one of the things that Zbrush has, which is a bit of nice functionality, is this transparent thing right here. So you've got these two things. One of them will load on your mesh lines, so you can actually see the polyframe itself, and then the other one is transparency, which will essentially make the items that aren't selected in your subtool list transparent or like ghostly, so you can see through them. In fact, you've got transparent and ghost here, so you can turn ghost off and get this sort of transparent look, or you can turn ghost on and it sort of makes it a little bit whiter and a little bit easier to see. So obviously from here you can obviously drag around to try and make it fit.
Center yellow square on here will actually, so when Tom's sort of dragging the red block or the green block, he's dragging it in one direction. The yellow square will drag it bigger and smaller in all directions. There's different buttons like inflate, but they don't do what you think they would do. So this is the best way to when you want to size something is to pull that bar if you want to size the whole object.
Right. So it's interesting. At the moment, when you're sizing a cowl, it's a bit of an art more than a science. Once you've got your initial reference to go from in the first place, it becomes easier. And what I mean by that is, fairly often makers will make a cowl and it'll be a slightly different size to how they thought it would be, either based on the shape of the cowl versus the shape of a normal head, or just through different variances in 3D printing, or even just simply human error. So once you have the size of a cowl, once you've actually produced it for the first time, let's say you're aiming for a 23 and you get something that's closer to a 23.5, it's a shame that you've got something that's a little bit bigger, but from there you are able to then compare digitally everything else. So if you know that you've got something and you've 3D printed something, or you've produced something that is guaranteed a 24 inch, a good rule of thumb is anything smaller than that by 5% gives you 23 inch, and you have to plus 5% to get 25. So every 5% you make it bigger or smaller from that point gives you an inch.
Again, if you wanted to size this 5% bigger, Tom, and instead of, so when you're dragging the yellow, you can go up in whatever. It'll go up. You can see the number just below 1.05,
Oh,
1.1.
it's left shift.
But if you click left shift, that will go up in increments, so you can get it more exact.
Yeah. So to make it 5%, if its standard size at the moment is 1, so to make it bigger by 5%, you'd want it to be at 1.05, or to make it smaller by 5%, you'd want to go down to 0.95.
That's it. Yeah.
That. But right now we don't want to do that, so I'm going to stop doing that, and I'm going to take it back to its original size, which we're pretty sure is a 23 inch. In fact, the bust that we loaded in here is a 24 inch, and you can see that actually it is a little bit bigger. You have to allow space for the urethane as well, so the thickness of the urethane will also fill up some of this space. So in fact, if I took the bust and I shrunk that down instead by 5%, down to 95, there you go. That essentially is a 23 inch head in a 23 inch cowl. But as we said before, every head is different. Every shape head is different. Every cowl is differently shaped.
Yeah, you get, you know, for me and Tom have a very similar sized head. However, I can put the JL War on, and I'm like, oh, it's really tight on my ears, Tom. I think it needs to be wider.
Yeah.
Tom puts it on, he's like, I've got bags of room. I don't know what you're on about.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, the chin fits me perfectly. The chin for him, he's got a pronounced chin, just goes flat. It's all, people say to us, it doesn't fit quite right. You might need to pad it out. You might, not everyone is going to have exactly the same shaped head. So there will be some padding.
Yeah.
Don't think I've cast my cowl, I've put it on, this is all over the shop, what's gone wrong. Nothing might have gone wrong. Yeah. It might just be your head is not ergonomically designed to match.
Right. All right, so what we've got is the cowl and the bust on this subtool menu, and you can actually turn off these. Whichever one you have selected will automatically show, but if you select one of them and you turn off the other, it'll actually disappear it entirely from the scene. It'll either come back if you make it re-emerge, or it'll come back if you just select it. But we're going to select off it because for the moment we don't want to use that. And in fact, what we could do is we could put it up at the top there and have the cowl on the bottom. So at this point in time, there are sometimes other things you might want to do. So depending on the file and depending on the head and who you're designing it for, if you're designing one for yourself and you've decided to 3D scan your own head, there are plenty of smartphones that can do that. You can load your head into here, you can size it up, get a good reference, make sure it's the correct size the cowl to it, but you also may need to edit features of the cowl, just basically like jaw lines and eyes and stuff. So one of the best ways of doing this is to basically go to B, press B on your keyboard for brushes, and then go to M, and that narrows it down to move, and it's the move tool that you want. And that is, as you can see, the shortcut on the keyboard is V.
So if you pressed BMV, it would automatically select the move tool, and on the top, where are we looking?
Top left hand side, just up here. So you've got move tool. Obviously if I hover over it, it says brush. You can bring up exactly the same menu by simply clicking on that, but honestly, best practice and the fastest way to navigate in Zbrush is to learn your shortcut keys. So B on the keyboard and then shorten it down by M and then select V, move. The next thing that it'd be really wise to do at this point, anytime you're dealing with a model that is symmetrical, turn on symmetry. It's one of the first things you should do, and you do that by just pressing X on your keyboard. And if I press X, you should see that other little red dot has appeared. So anything I now edit on this side will also happen on the other side automatically.
One other thing I always do, Tom, and you might not have come across this because you always center your models. If you don't center your model, obviously symmetry is going to be slightly off, which will cause a problem. However, on your right-hand side, the bar that goes all the way down the bottom, you've got L symmetry. So where you've got frame, 3 off, that's it. L symmetry is now local symmetry, so it's symmetry for that thing. So you can turn that on and just check that it's, again, what Tom did, working, that it's in the center.
Yeah. So actually, do you know what? I'll demonstrate that for a second. So let me go to BT and transpose, right? I'm going to turn the symmetry off. And I'm just going to move this out a little bit, okay? And then I'm going to go to turn the symmetry back on. And you can see this there. The symmetry is way off. Yeah?
Yeah, I always go to the point of the nose to check that we're in the center.
Yeah. So I'm going to go BMV again. I've got my move tool, and you can see I'm way off symmetry. But if I were to turn that L sim on, there you go. It goes back to being symmetrical. But best practice is to keep that off and keep the actual model itself centered. So I'm just going to undo history to make sure that that's...
100% best practice, because when you work on these models sculpting, you can work very, very close, and you assume it's doing what you want on the other side, and then when you zoom out, you're just like, I forgot to do that.
So the next tool that you want to know about is the sizing tool, like the brush tool. Essentially, now we've got move selected, by just clicking on the model and dragging, you can basically move and morph sort of areas of this model. Now there are loads of different tools that you can use, so loads of different brushes essentially. So if you wanted to, you can go with I don't know, what's a damn standard. So
I was going to say damn standard.
Damn standard. So here I can see you can basically start to engrave, and you can start to play around with that model. You can actually edit the size of the brush by holding down S on your keyboard, and then that will edit the draw size, and then basically let go of the slider, let go of S. But you can also do that up here. All of your brush tools will be up at the top. So you've got draw size, you've got intensity, and you've got focal shift. Focal shift basically changes the size of the focus. So here I've got focal shift very high, and you can see, in fact,
you can tell from the red circle there, you've got there was a small red dot. So basically you've got a point where it sort of feathers out, and a point where you can have it just a blunt instrument.
Yeah, exactly. The more,
And I think one important thing to talk about at this point as well is, obviously, you mentioned earlier about, like, you can turn on your poly mesh, and people might be looking at what you've done then going, why has it gone all crinkled and it's not doing it smoothly? Is because what we're working on here is something that's called a decimated model, which is a low poly model. When you buy a model, it's going to be as low poly as possible because it's a large file. So in order to get the file size down, they take the poly count down.
Yeah, that's right. It basically, when the best practice for making any file is you want to make it as small as possible. So when you decimate a model, it finds the most simplest mesh that it can use to achieve the basic look of that model, which is what it's done. So if I turn the lines on here, you can see in the mesh that you've basically got, or the polyframe, that you've basically got all these different triangles, and those different triangles are what's making up the model. In some places the triangles are bigger, and in some places the triangles are closer together. Obviously the smaller and tighter the mesh, the more detail you can get in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to BMV, which is going to be the move tool, and I'm going to hold down S. I'm going to make that much bigger like this. And what you can do is if you want to try and match it your face a little bit more, you can try and move around the features. So I'm going to make this a little bit smaller, and if you want to, you can do very gradual things. Like, I don't suggest doing anything too drastic, but you can pull out the chin, you can play around with the basic shape of the model, and sometimes this helps. Sometimes you see files out there, and the files are made or taken from sometimes games or sometimes modelled on an image of Batman that has a very strong or very big jaw, whereas a lot of people don't have a jaw that size. And remember that in the end you're going to be making this out of hopefully urethane, and urethane has a stretch to it. So sometimes it's much better to have a very short jaw that allows your natural jaw to stretch it out, rather than to have basically a much larger jaw that flops down.
Yeah, what we've coined floppy jaw syndrome is we see it in a lot of cowls where people have sized it to just a normal head, and the jawline, something typically like the AK Batgirl. You see a lot of them with quite floppy jaws because the jawline isn't held in by anything. It hasn't got a neck, so it's going to droop down if your face doesn't fill that out, if you haven't got some cheeks on you. So the better thing to do is pull that tighter, and then people can pull the cowl onto their jaw.
So, a little bit of introduction to the file itself. This is I think we might have said before, the cowl from the Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, the game. We had this file done for us by a sculptor called Deving. He's very, very, very good at what he does. Sometimes we do our own designs for things like our gauntlets, and we do our own sculpting. But look, sculpting in Zbrush is a whole different skill. It's a whole different ballpark. There are people out there that are much better at it than us. So we don't mind getting our files from them. There are many other makers that do the same thing, and you can do it too. In fact, even if you type in Batman Cowl, I think, into something like what's the website, Phil? That
Thingyverse.
Has Thingyverse.
All those sort of things.
You can find these things everywhere. So you'll see that with this cowl, the eyes have been closed up. You'll see the mouth has been closed up, and you'll see that you have this stuff here that's essentially attached to the bottom of it. Almost looks like shoulders. This is essentially called flashing. So this is the area of your cowl that you will have to essentially cut away once it's produced. But you want that cut line. Cut lines produce like nice neat lines as long as you cut them neatly enough. If you didn't have that in there, there'd be nothing for the silicone when you mold it to cover over. The silicone would create a hook on itself and would flow in through the mouth or would flow into the wrong places. You'll see exactly what we mean later on when we do some different tutorials on this, but suffice to say, this stuff here is called flashing, and you want it because it's going to essentially end up being the base of your entire model.
And it also helps keep your urethane in that, let's call it a bowl shape, because otherwise what happens is you try to get up to those edges and the urethane will just spill right over and out of your cowl.
Yeah, when you sort of design these things like the molds, you sort of have to think inside out and upside down all the time, and in negatives and positives, because in the end, if you're going to put this in a rotocaster, or if you're going to be casting it, you're going to have a bowl that's in front of you shaped like that, shaped like the inside of a cowl, and you're going to be putting urethane in there and spreading it around. So that's why you want to have the mouth filled, you want to have the eyes, you want to have a nice brim above the detail that you're trying to capture, so that you don't end up basically getting to the edge of the actual cowl itself and then spilling urethane all over the place.
It's funny, I've just I've been following this guy on another Star Wars forum, and he's created a really nice silicone cowl but hasn't put that brim on there.
Yeah, I've seen it before.
It's going to
Well,
cause issues.
yeah. Hey, hopefully, hopefully we can save other people from making the same mistakes.
Yeah.
Right. So once we've got the cowl like this, one of the other first things we need to do in order to get it ready to print is we need to make a base for it. We need to make something that eventually the shell that we create for it, the matrix mold, can hold onto and bolt it to. So the matrix mold and the 3D printed shell around the cowl doesn't move positions and come out of alignment from the actual cowl itself. This what we're producing right here is called the master. And
Tom, sorry. Why would you do that? Why would you bother wasting all this time in a 3D program when you can just slap some silicon on it, slap some fiberglass on it, and call it a day?
well, that's a very good question. So one of the bonuses of making matrix molds, and especially 3D printing them, is that you get to do all of the design digitally first, and you get to plan it out very nicely, and you get to have something that in the end looks very neat. Not just that, but if you were to take this cowl right now and you were to just print it off as it is, and you just put some silicon on it, which is a quick way of making molds, and then you basically put your fiberglass shell on it. The fiberglass shell is molded to fit that silicon perfectly, and if you pull it and you find that, pull the silicon off the master and you find that you've got any mistakes in there, any air bubbles or anything that makes the cowl look really bad, then you have to get rid of the silicon, but you also have to get rid of the fiberglass shell that you've created on it. And there's no way to tell if it's going to come out successfully until you've made the fiberglass shell. Whereas by putting in the time now, doing it in Zbrush and making yourself a matrix mold, if you put the shell around the outside of the master and you pour the silicon actually in between the gap in between the shell and the master, and it comes out wrong, all you have to do is take the silicon off, reassemble the shell, and you can pour the silicon again. A lot of that to a lot of people is going to sound like mumbo jumbo. Do you know what I mean? They're not going to know what I'm talking about, but as
At
we
this
go
point,
as we go through these guides, the terminology of what we're talking about you'll become familiar with. But the terminology that you need to know right now is that this is the master that we are creating. It's essentially like the print that we want to replicate in other materials. And the best thing to do to prep the master is to make sure it's got flashing, get it sized up, and then you want to create a nice base for it that the shell can lock onto. So what I like to do is I like to go to insert, and I like to just get a cylinder, and I'm going to go to B, and then I'm going to press T for transpose, and then I'm going to go to transpose, or you can press R. I'm going to get that cylinder and I'm going to shrink it right down like so.
So you can see there that it's added another sub tool to the menu at the side, which is your cylinder. So that's what Tom's imported. So he's imported another subtool, which is just, you can do a square, you can do a cylinder, but a cylinder is a lot easier to match the base.
That's right. It's something that I can edit independently of the other subtools, the other objects that are in this scene. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically slide it down to the bottom, but I'm going to slide it down to sort of just nearly the bottom, not quite. So the bottom little bit is still sticking out ever so slightly. If I wanted to, I could do a front-on view like that and just make sure it's there. Let's have a little zoom in. Yeah, you can see it's still sticking out the bottom there, a little tiny fraction. Lift it to about there. Alright, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the top. I'm going to click on this little guy just to give me a better view of, in fact, there we go.
I'll check the back as well, Tom.
Straight down. Check the back of the model to make sure it's on. I'll check the side-on view.
That the cowl doesn't, the peak of the back of the cowl doesn't go below.
Ah,
for any
right,
reason.
yeah.
If you've got something like a Keaton, is it the Keaton? I haven't got one here, but some of them have lower backs than they do
That's
fronts.
that's pretty close actually. So that's a
Yeah.
really good point. Okay, so actually that's a good thing that you've raised. So the very back of this cowl is very, very, very close to this base that we're creating. So maybe one of the best things to do at this point in time would be to try and actually lower the base a little bit to extend it a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the cowl and I'm going to turn that subtool off, which is the ring that I just made. Zoom out a little bit. I'm going to turn... in fact, again, there's a few different ways to do this. But I think the best way is if I go to B, I'm going to go to this Z modeler.
Oh dear Lord, you're going into Z modeler. That's a whole different bag now, Tom.
Right, I'm going to zoom in on essentially this bottom. Hold down your space bar and it brings up this menu. From this menu, it's a big extensive menu, but you essentially want to select polygroup flat island, and then you want to just hold down your left mouse button in the middle of a big poly on the bottom ridge, and you want to, with your left mouse button held down, press Alt to basically sort of cycle through different colours to recolor that poly. I like to colour it something fairly noticeably different.
What you're doing is you're creating a new polygroup, so
Yeah.
you can select just that area without selecting the rest of the cowl. So you can see you've got the cowl is a red polygroup, and now the base is mustard polygroup.
Yeah, or like a sort of greeny olivey thing. Right. So now polygroup, holding down spacebar again, you can select transpose. Transpose, and then you want polygroup, and probably you want polygroup all. And then you want to again go to the middle and click on that just once. Click, and here you go. You've got your transpose. So now, what you can do is let's go back to the front. Let's zoom right out. You can now use this tool right here to basically drag just that polygroup, and it drags the surrounding mesh with it. So you can basically stretch like that and just stretch the bottom a little bit further than you want it. Probably not as far as that. So I'm just going to press Ctrl Z to undo, or you can drag back the history here. And I'm just going to go about there. In fact, at this time, I might even want to turn on that for reference.
Yeah, I mean, the reason you might think that's close and you'll get away with it, the reason we're doing this is because how close that is, you might find that when you pour the silicon in, it doesn't quite creep under that, and it's going to create an air bubble.
And also, when you're casting, you want to have a nice amount of silicon, a nice amount of flashing to cut away above that to catch the excess silicon. You don't, when you pour in the urethane and you're moving it around, you don't just want to go up to the line, you want to go over it. You want to give yourself something to cut away, because that's what produces a nice line.
Yes, yeah.
So I've dragged it down a little bit. I think we've got enough room, and you can see what's weird is, did you explain this, Phil? It's masked everything else.
But basically, masking means it has frozen everything else in place, so it goes darker. And there's masking tools that you can use, but basically, the way Tom's done it here, it's automatically masked everything else apart from a few polys it's going to need to stretch, and pulled that down.
Yeah.
So
one of the
masking might be better for the next tutorial, not the next one, but the one to do with how you create the whole shell.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, just briefly speaking, basically holding down Control gives you this mask tool, and you're able to mask off and unmask different areas of your poly. So if I turn the mesh off, it might be easier to see that by going like this, holding down. Oh, let's go back to the front again.
Frame it.
Yeah, frame it.
And what you'll see as well is when Tom holds down that Alt button on the top left, you can see that it changes to mask. So and again, several different tools you can use to mask. You can use a lasso, like almost paint. There's different brushes you can use in Photoshop or Paint that'll do the same thing in different ways.
Yeah, holding down Control and dragging over something masks it, and then to unmask it, you can just basically drag a box over any area that doesn't have anything in it, and it'll mask that instead.
Yeah. So what we've done there, we've transposed it down, and then you want to drag on anywhere that isn't the model to get rid of that mask that is automatically placed on the cowl for you.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's, Phil explained it perfectly. What I've essentially done is it masked it, and once you've done that, you want to unmask it. And all I've done is I've held down Control, and I've just dragged a little box in an empty area to unmask everything after I've stretched the bottom down. So now what I want to do is I want to get the cylinder. I want to go to B, T, and transpose, or press R on the keyboard. And with the cylinder selected, I want to then move the cylinder down to just below the bottom, just like so. And I should probably be looking at the back, seeing as that's what we wanted to make sure that we had enough space for. There we go, cool. Now, I'm going to go to the top, the very top, and I can just click on the top of this guy's head to make sure I've got it perfectly flat down. And I'm going to sort of try and mold this cylinder to fit around the base much more. In fact, what I might want to do is actually have a look from the bottom. There we go. So what I'm looking for is if this is where the main bust starts, or where the main cowl starts, or at least the flashing starts, I want to make sure I have a nice brim all the way round. Again, there are several ways of doing this, but this is the way that I prefer. So what I'd do with this one is, can you see where it's closest to the edge? So it's closest to the edge there, closest to the edge at the top, closest to the edge there. So I'd make sure that you have like a nice amount of brim there, really. So I'm going to make it maybe a little bit wider that way. Fantastic. And then what you can always do as well is you can go to BMV, go to Move, size that up a little bit, and then
You're going to want to put your symmetry on.
Yes, I am.
Oh.
Turn symmetry on, press X button. Now you can start to move these walls in a little bit. So I'm just going to go again to the bottom. And I'm just gonna move them in. In fact, you can move that out. You can move everything around a little bit to sort of fit just that little bit more around. There we go. So maybe move it out a little bit more. There in. I'm going to resize a little bit, make it a little bit smaller, just so I can sort of tuck in a little bit more. The move tool always moves up, down, left, right from the position that you're looking at the model from. So if I go to the side right now, you'll notice that that base hasn't moved up or down. It's only been manipulated in the two axes. Whereas if I'm looking at it this way and I use the move tool, you know, you can move it up and down and all kinds of crazy directions. So you don't want it to be moving on the Z axis. So you want to be looking at straight from the bottom, and you can assure that you're doing that by basically either clicking, there you go, by basically dragging it down and clicking on the bottom of the head.
That's a good point why sort of ZBrush is a little bit easier to use, because if you're using something like Fusion and you try to make that move that Tom's just done, you're going to find that you've actually moved it up and down, and all over the shop instead of just sideways.
Yeah.
Um,
Right, I'm going to go back to transpose. Transpose, you don't need to do that, of course, because you've got the axes that you can choose anyway. So I'm actually going to make it a little bit bigger. A little bit bigger. There you go. That might seem like a very big base, but you'll thank yourself in the long run for giving yourself a bit of a bigger base like that. It does cost a little bit more to print it like that as well, because obviously the print volume is bigger, but in the long run, we think it pays off.
and you'll see when removing the silicon from the cowl, we have discovered having that base to give yourself something to pry from. The bigger it is, the better you are.
Yeah, so one of the issues with Batman masks is that it has a chin, a nice chin there. So, like I said before, when you're thinking about working upside down, the chin is almost like a hook. So not only are you working blind around the underneath of the chin, because there's no way that you can see into the mold to see the underneath of the chin, but when you're pulling the silicon off in the first place, the chin acts like a hook that you've got to get the silicon rolled over and past to release it off the rest of the mold. And you'll see what we mean by that later on. But
Doesn't look so bad on this model though. It's got
No.
a very small chin, but anything with a quite a large chin, or even just an average chin, like the Fabric, or especially the JK, the Gotham Knight,
yeah,
that has quite an extensive chin to try and pull that silicon over while it's also sort of straining on the back of the neck on the other side of the silicon. So
yeah.
you'll see what we mean.
Okay, so at this point in time, I want to start using live Boolean tools, and that's basically a way of subtracting and interjecting objects within each other, and then making those results into other objects that you can use. This is what I mean by that. Up in the top left hand corner, you've got this button here that says live Boolean, and you want to turn that on, right? Now, under the subtools section here, you have these little icons. So this icon right here basically means that objects, as they interact with each other, they both exist as solids within the same space. However, if you select this one, what it does is it takes away from the one that's above it. So you can see now that I've turned that to there, you can see that what it's doing is it's subtracting itself from the shape of the cowl. And then if I were to go to this one, what it's now giving us is only the polys or the mesh where those two items interject each other, where they cross over each other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that on normal, and actually I'm going to swap these items around. So I'm going to drag the cowl below the base, and I'm going to ask to subtract. So what it's doing there is it's subtracting the cowl from that big base, and that's important because what we want to do is we want to separate these two discs. We want to separate the middle bit from the outer bit so that basically the inside of that master isn't closed off, it's still open. So what we're going to do now is, if we go down to, and it's important to check by the way by looking top down, that there is clearance all the way around.
Also, another thing to be mindful of is that you have all your other subtools turned off, because when you ask the system to cut this, if anything else is turned on, it's going to blend all that together.
Right, yeah.
Does that make sense?
That's right, yeah. It'll definitely create results that you don't want. Yeah. So what I'm going to do is you've got the subtool menu up here, and then down here you have a menu that's called Boolean. You want to click on Boolean, and you want to click Make Boolean Mesh. And what that's doing is it's turning everything that you're seeing right now into its own usable object. Because right now you're just doing a bit of trickery. Right now you're doing essentially a preview of the model of what it would look like, as opposed to it actually being in existence. So What I can now do is now that I've clicked that and everything's gone through, everything's okay, I'm going to go to Insert, and you'll see down here you've had this new item made that's called UMesh PM3D Cylinder 3D1. I'm going to click on that. I mean, it might say something else on yours. It might give itself a different name, but it'll be something similar. You want to click on that to insert it. And now you can see that we've sort of got this weird pattern over it. That's because you've got two of the exact same item that are trying to basically exist in the same space at the same time. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take the UMesh, I'm going to drag it to the bottom. Just for the moment, I'm going to turn it off. Then I'm going to go back to the cowl, or back to the original cylinder, and I'm going to make them whole again. So in fact, I'm going to go back to the cowl, I'm going to make it whole again. And there we go. In fact, now both of those pieces are back to their original state before we messed around with them. But we have this item here. We have the UMesh cylinder. So if I go to the UMesh cylinder, I'm going to turn that on, and I'm going to turn the other two subtools off. We have now something that we can edit, which is just that original shape. Now we want to separate these shells. We want to split it, okay? If I go to split, and then I go to split to parts, it'll give me this not an undoable operation, blah 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 blah. Well, that's fine, because I know that if anything here goes wrong, I can just reload this from the insert menu that we did a second ago. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click OK, or you can click always OK if you're confident that you always want to do it. So click OK, and you can now see here under the subtool it's now separated that into two separate items. And if I go to the polyline, there you go, you can see now that it's separated them into two items. Turn the polylines off. So what I want to do is I essentially want to delete the middle part. So I'm going to select the bottom bit, which of course makes it lighter, whichever item I've selected, and I want to go to delete. It'll give me the warning. I'll click OK, and there you go, it's deleted that. So now if I turn the cowl back on, we've now basically got the master with the ring around the bottom, just like that. Now, something else I like to do at this point, I like to make backups, and I always think it's good to make backups, and I also think it's good to name your files. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually take this subtool right here, and I'm going to click duplicate, and it will duplicate that subtool, and I'm going to drag it to the bottom. And then I'm also going to duplicate that subtool, which is the one that I want to keep. I'm going to drag that to the very bottom, and I'm going to make a folder here. So there you go, new folder. I'm going to call it backups. Oh, I've got caps lock turned on, that's nice.
Yeah, Tom's a lot better at naming his files as he goes, which is quite important, because
got there eventually.
Part way through the project, you're going to need to look for something, and I always end up coming up a crapper of not having my files named, and either you can end up deleting the wrong thing or just doing a lot of mistakes. So if you sort of good practice from the start, create yourself a folder you can back up all those little extras into, and name your files.
I just did something that I forgot happened. If you drag everything out of a folder, it will delete or make that folder disappear. So something has to be in it. So what I'm going to do is, you can see it's created itself and it's automatically put that in there. I'm actually just going to drag all of these items into that backups folder, and I'm going to close the folder by clicking on the folder icon. And then I'm also going to turn that folder off in view. So now I've just got these two ones that I basically need. Now at this point in time, I'm now going to merge these items. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the top one, and I'm going to go down to the merge menu right here, and it says merge down. I'm going to merge down. It'll ask me if I want to continue. I will, because I've made backups. And there we go. Both of those items have now been merged into the same subtool. So now, whatever I do editing wise, it will do it to both of these items at the same time. So I have a solid model here, and I have this little lip on the bottom. Now that lip is irritating because I want this base to sit all perfectly flat. Okay, so I want to make the entire thing flat. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to insert.
That lip was important because you needed to cut through that base model fully.
Yes.
So if you think about saving time and thinking I'll just get it right, it doesn't. You have to do this part because again, I've come a cropper thinking I can make some shortcuts, and it just causes you an issue in the long run.
Yeah. And the other thing that I'll say is again, with ZBrush, there's loads of different ways to skin a cat. Like, this might be a quick way, this might be a slightly longer way. Someone might know a better way of doing this, but this is the way that we do it. This is the way that we know how. So what we're going to do is, I can either insert anything with a flat top, cube or cylinder. So I'm just going to go with insert cube, zoom right out to get a good view of that, B, T, transpose, and I'm going to drag it all the way down. I'm going to make sure that it is big enough to envelop the entire bottom. There we go. And I'm just going to go to... Now, this is one of those moments where it's quite good to have these tools at the top, because what I want to do is I want to zoom in quite close to there. I want to zoom in quite close to the bottom of the cowl, and I want to drag this up so it's just sort of eating away at the bottom of here. But the move tool's all the way over there, so if I unlock it, I can actually move the move tool up to the top of that block and then lock it again, and that enables me to sort of zoom right in a little bit more. In fact, what I might want to do as well is unlock it and send it further over to that corner just there. There we go. There we go. And of course, what I really want to do is I want to subtract it from the cowl. So I'm going to go to here. I'm going to go to that subtract tool because I've still got live boolean turned on. And there we go. If I adjust it up a little bit, you can see now that it's sort of eating away. It's shaved it all off so that it's level. Beautiful. I'm going to zoom out. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create boolean again. So I'm going to go to boolean. I'm going to make boolean mesh. You can see up at the top here it's doing its magic. Wait for it to go all the way along. So right, I've created the boolean mesh. I've gone to insert, and now I just want to insert this right here, which is the U mesh of the SSK TJL cowl. Alright, there you go. Done the same thing as it did before, because it's creating the new one in exactly the same position the old one, gives it this weird mottled look. So then all I have to do is turn off the other two. Right, this is the master that I now want to start to work from. As good practice, it'd be good to save the file before we go any further. You might have even wanted to do that at the beginning, so you can just go to File up here. You can go to Save As, and then you can save it as, let's save it as Conroy Cowl Master Matrix mold. Alright, save that. Well, the other thing that I'm going to do now as well is I'm also going to rename this to be called Conroy Master, and I'm also going to call it 23 inches, just so you know what's been done so far. What I'm going to do again is I'm going to move these other two files right here into backups. So I'm going to pop those both in there, close backups again, make sure that that's all turned off, make sure that one is turned on. Right, so bolts. Now at this point in time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a depending on what bolt size you want to use, which is like normally anything from M5s to M10s if you're using something really heavy. We want to use maybe like M6s, M8s. We don't want anything too hefty. You don't need anything too hefty as far as bolts go, not for something this size. So if you are going to make yourself some M8 bolt holes for everything to bolt together, the master bolting together with the shell, you want to create holes that are about maybe 8.5 to 9 millimeters wide, just to have that little bit of clearance, because you're going to be 3D printing, you're going to be FDM 3D printing these items. You don't want it to be super snug. You don't want to have a battle when you're putting the shell together and taking it apart to pull in and out those bolts. So you want the holes to be ever so slightly bigger than the bolts themselves that you're using. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, in AutoCAD...
Sorry, I was going to add, Tom, what you'll also get is a bit of seepage from the silicon that's going to come out those holes. So you need to be able to obviously knock that bolt out afterwards. If it's tight to get in the first place, then great, you might not get silicon, but it will still lock onto that bolt.
Yeah, that's right. What we're saying right now will become like loads more evident when we actually get to the point when we're like pouring the silicone. You know exactly what Phil's saying right now, but essentially he's 100% correct. You want to
getting in that bolt in quick.
Yeah,
as well.
Yeah.
You don't want to be trying to push it through because you need that silicon's going off. You know.
Yeah. So, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to quickly make those bolts in AutoCAD, or I'm just going to make one of them, and I'm going to save it so that I know it is a hole that is basically 9 millimeters wide to accept an M8 bolt quite easily, and I'll load that in a second. So I need to import them into this scene.
So what Tom's going to do now is he's going to navigate away from the cowl onto a different scene. So he selected the star, because if you import into the same scene as the cowl, it will import this bolt hole maker that we've done over the cowl. It'll get rid of the cowl. So when Tom imports this now, instead of getting rid of the cowl, it gets rid of this star.
So it'll take a while to import. You just click OK. There we go. And there we have our bolt hole. And what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our original scene, which is this one right here. You can see there's a little 7 next to it because there's 7 objects in that scene. Of course, most of them are hidden in here. We're now going to make sure the subtool menu is open. Scroll down, go to insert, and here you have the object that you can actually insert into this scene. So M8 8mm bolt holes right there. And then what I want to do is go to frame, and you can see that it's absolutely miles away because whatever I made them in had a totally different center to the Zbrush, one of the little quirks. So I'm going to go to B, T, R for transpose. I want to make sure that I unlock. I want it to go to the center of the object. Let's pan over here a little bit. I'm going to lock it again, and I'm going to take it back to home, which is going to be the center of the space. If I zoom...
Yeah, you click frame twice. Sorry, so click frame once will bring you to the object, and if you click frame again, it'll bring you to the both objects.
Right. That's right. So what I want to do is click home, boop, and it'll pop it straight over to the middle of the scene. and then I can just move it and drag it out a little bit so I can see it, and I can see that it's sort of horizontal right now. So then using the red rotational tool, because I want to rotate it on that axis, I want to rotate it round by 90 degrees. Now you can see it's quite hard to get 90 degrees there, because you can rotate it at such small fractions, but if you hold down shift, it'll actually lock onto increments of 5, which makes it easier to control and rotate it at 90 degrees. And now if we check it from side on, 90 degrees down. Alright, from here,
What you want to be doing as well, Tom, is you want to be working on the left hand side of your model so that you can copy across.
You're not wrong. Right.
So when Tom's doing his placements of the bolts, he'll be able to copy across the left hand side to the right hand side. And if he does it on the right, it won't copy.
Yeah, so with symmetry on, and when you want to do copy over and copy symmetries, it works out its symmetry only in one direction, from left to right, not always right to left. So anyways, what I want to do is, I've got my bolt hole and it's going through the lower lip. What I aim to do is I aim to try and place the bolt holes as far on the outside as possible while still having something good to grip onto. So if I sort of zoom in a little bit here, you maybe want it a little bit further in from that edge, probably about 2/3 from where the actual model of the cowl begins, and maybe 1/3 away from the edge, maybe even closer to 1/4.
Yeah, too close to the actual cowl itself is, once we start making the shell, you'll see if you try to put the bolt in, the shell will get in the way. So the further out you are, the more room you've got to get that bolt in.
Yeah. So one of the things that you can do is you've got these directional arrows, so you can actually move around the object very freely on the axis that you're looking at, on like a 2-dimensional plane rather than a 3-dimensional plane. So no matter which direction you're looking at it in, it will always move front on to you, which means you want to have it be looking at it perfectly from the bottom, and you can just rearrange and place like this, and it won't travel along the z-axis up and down, it'll only travel flat to where you are. And why that's useful is because what you want to do is place one wherever you want it, like roughly there, and then you click duplicate down here, and you can see that it's duplicated the subtool, enabling you to basically move another one on a little bit more, and then you can duplicate again, and you can just start placing these holes along the base wherever you want them.
Yeah, there's no set distance, there's no, you don't, to be honest, what we end up doing is we put a lot of holes in, and then sometimes half of them we won't use. Other times you're going to get a bit of seepage on the silicon, or it's not sat quite right, so you might need to get another bolt in. So it's always handy to have more holes than you need in life.
Yeah, what you don't want to do, that's a mantra. What you don't want to do is you don't want to have it on the center line, because the center line are where these shells are going to join, so you don't want to have any bolts that go through a wall, a vertical wall. Check it from above, check that none of them are spearing up and through the model itself, and that there's a nice amount of clearance, it's not going to bother anything. Then I want to go up on this list. So I've got this subtool list. You can edit how many subtools are visible on that list at any one time, like basically how big the list is, and you've always got this scroll bar to like scroll up and down them anyway. But I like to have mine long enough so that there's normally a couple of empty spaces below the last one. So I'm going to go to the very first of those bolt holes I created, and I'm actually now going to merge down. So I'm going to select merge on the right hand side here, I'm going to select merge down, and because I'm going to do this quite a few times, I'm just going to click OK, yeah, always OK, and then I'm going to merge down again, merge down again, merge down again, and what it's doing is every time I'm merging down, it's turning another one of those bolt holes into essentially the same object. They're all joined rather than being individual subtools. So merge down, merge down, merge down. So now I've got all of them. Now I want to essentially mirror them onto the other side. Phil?
One good thing about ZBrush is you can set it up in many different ways. You can have all these little extra buttons at the bottom,
right,
if you want. So I've got all mine at the bottom, but Tom, what he's done is he's gone to geometry. His is set up as a standard ZBrush, as you have it loaded fresh. So geometry, which is below subtools, and then into modify topology, and then mirror and weld. So what that's going to do, it's going to mirror it across like you can see now, and it welds it to be one subtool. So it's all one subtool. Not, obviously you've got your cowl and the base, which is one subtool, and then all those bolts as one subtool.
Yeah. So now that those have all been created in a big array, what I want to do is I want to subtract them, make sure that live boolean is turned on, and there you go, it's made all the bolt holes for you.
Now again, you can see there that you've got these little holes in the mesh. Don't worry about that. This is just a preview. When you create your boolean, it will come out properly and without those holes. It's a little bit of a quirk of ZBrush sometimes. Sometimes it will come out like that, and it means you've done something wrong. But most of the time it's fine.
That's right. So what I want to do now is I want to go to Boolean, I want to go to Make Boolean Mesh, let that run up here. And once that's finished, often you can actually access it before that little menu stops. So once it's finished, you can go to under Subtool, Insert, and then it'll be the latest one there, which is UMesh at the bottom. There we go, and as per usual, it's loaded in two things over the top, so you want to get rid of the originals that you were tinkering with. In fact, I'm going to turn that off as well. And there you have the one with the holes in.
Quite important at this point, not to delete your bolt holes and to put them into that backups folder, because you will need them later for creating the shell.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'm also going to do right now is I'm actually going to rename this one. This is now pretty much the final thing that you will have now ready to print or send off to the printers. So I'm going to name this rename Final Master Conroy 23-inch. There we go. Okay, so one of the last things that we now need to do is we now just need to create some keys. And keys essentially are objects or little shapes that help the two bits of shell, or the shell and the master, lock into each other into a nice secure position, so they're not out of alignment. So what I like to do is I like to go to Subtool, and I'm going to go to Insert, and I'm just going to insert a sphere. Then I'm going to go to B and T, transpose that down, make it relatively small, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move it down so that it's sort of just poking out of the base. What I want is a half sphere poking out the top of the base, maybe even slightly less than a half sphere. So if I, for instance, view it from the side, I'm going to make that a bit smaller as well. Make it about maybe about that big. I'm going to put it just down slightly so that it's just, as you can see there, the center line of the sphere is just below the base. And then I'm going to sort of use the red and the blue move tools to move it in place. In fact, now that it's positioned height wise how I want it, what I can do is just give myself a top down view, and I'm going to move it over to the left hand side, because when we mirror and weld, it'll for some reason you normally only want to do it one way. So what I'm going to do is back to that top view, and I'm going to do the same thing I did when we did the bolts here. So we're just going to basically duplicate, and then you don't need many of these, as long as you've got a couple on each bits of shell. So I'm just going to dot them around the edge, maybe slightly less than the amount of bolt holes that we've got. So I'm going to duplicate, and I'm going to pop that one maybe there, duplicate. And again, I want to avoid where I think the joins in the eventual shell are going to be. So that means I want to avoid going slap bang in the middle. And I think I'm just going to put another one there. Yep, I think for the moment. In fact, let's have one more. I'm just going to go to the top again, just because I'm being picky. And let's go duplicate, and I'll move one to about there. Cool. Alright, then what I want to do is I want to merge them the way that I did with the bolts. So I'm going to click on the very top one, scroll down a little bit so I've got them all in sight, and I want to go to merge down. I'm going to go merge down. I'm going to do this quite a few times, so always click OK. Merge down, merge down, merge down. That's merged them all together, and then I'm just going to go to geometry down here. I'm going to go to modify topology. I'm going to go to mirror and weld, and that's welded them onto the other side. So that's now given me some keys and some bolt holes. And now this model is pretty much ready to print, which means it's ready to be exported. So I'm going to go back to Subtool, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to merge these together. So I'm going to merge down, all one object now. And now I'm going to scroll up, and I'm going to export. So making sure that that's the one that's in the scene, you can see it, and making sure that's the one selected. Export. And you can see here it's save type as OBJ, which is fine, and it's already selected the title of the actual subtool to save it as, which is fine. Final Master Conroy 23-inch OBJ. Yeah, okay.
And again, I'll just mention there are several different ways to export things in Zbrush. However, sometimes we've exported things in different ways, thinking it's better, and they've actually gone down in size by 5%. So this is the best way to export things. Just export it from the scene. You know, you might see some other videos that say, oh, you can do this and do that.
Yeah, it's weird.
I've tried it.
For some reason, when you export into any other formats such as STLs rather than OBJs, we found that it does, for some reason, adjust the sizing. And sometimes it can be way off, and then sometimes it can be so fractional that you don't notice it until
you've cast yourself a set of fins.
yeah, that's correct.
And
right.
That's it.
So that's essentially how you get to this point. You've exported the file. I think in the next video we'll be talking about lesson 2, printing the master. So where to get it printed, print settings, if you're going to print it yourself, if you want to outsource it to somewhere else. We'll go through all of that and we'll see you next time.
Cool. See you next time, guys. Thanks for tuning in.